everyone, and welcome to the first episode of Land Matters, a new podcast from the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. We're a think tank based in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and I'm your host, Anthony Flint. In this series, we'll take a look behind the scenes at what really makes cities tick, the policies and innovations we're seeing in booming metropolitan regions all around the country, all around the world, and more often than not, the key elements of more sustainable, equitable, and livable cities can be traced back to land. One of the things we do research on is the taxation of land, and for a lot of people that's something very familiar, the property tax. Cities and towns do regular assessments to determine the value of property, commercial or residential, and send out the bills. It's a hugely important source of revenue for municipalities. Now, there are many twists and turns in the way the property tax gets treated. It's subject to tax caps like California's Proposition 13, or here in Massachusetts, Proposition 2.5. Cities trying to lure businesses like Amazon and GE promise the companies they'll make the property tax bills go away for years and years. And there's one more financial arrangement that sounds technical, but it's incredibly pervasive, and that's tax increment financing. It's being used increasingly by cities to jumpstart economic development, and in this mechanism, in tax increment financing, or TIF, the anticipated future property tax revenue for a given development project is tallied up over a period of 15 or 20 years and often more, and that money essentially gets used up front to make the project happen in the first place. Our recent report, Improving Tax Increment Financing for Economic Development, found that there are at least 10,000 TIF districts currently in 49 states. By the way, only Arizona doesn't allow it. Some places have been going crazy with this financial instrument. Over the last decade, for example, the number of TIF districts in Iowa grew from 949 to 3,340. But there's also been a bit of a backlash against TIF. Those worried that it diverts property tax revenues from schools, those concerned about backroom deals and giveaways to developers, and many residents, particularly in rebounding post-industrial cities like St. Louis, that TIF is only aggravating gentrification and displacement. With us today is the author of that report, David Merriman, an insightful economist at the University of Illinois at Chicago. David scoured the country looking for case studies on TIF, and without question is one of the foremost experts on the subject. He joins us from Chicago. David Merriman, thank you for joining the conversation at Land Matters.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
Well, let's start with the basics. I think of TIF as a way of sort of sequestering anticipated future property tax revenues for a given project, so the money is available sooner or upfront, making the project possible. Basically, cities can get a little creative with this kind of financing, or a little bit more flexibility in this kind of financing, maybe borrow against that anticipated revenue. Still, what TIF is not well understood. You've talked a lot about this tool and seen it used all over. How do you describe TIF when somebody asks you, say, at a cocktail party? What is TIF?
Well, I think you've got really the right idea. The key thing that TIF does is it takes revenue from the appreciation or the rise in value of a particular, generally pretty small area, and the revenue that would have been generated by the property tax, and it funnels that revenue back into the area to aid economic development. And it's usually under the control of a city or a redevelopment agency or something like that. And as you say, it can be used in a variety of ways. A lot of times it's combined with other financing sources. It may be used to secure bond financing. And just there's any number of different ways that the money is used.
All right. Well, you spent about 2 years, as I mentioned, doing this the research for the Lincoln Institute TIF report. And one of the things that really jumped out at me was the rapid increase in the use of tax increment financing. For something that's a little complicated and not very well understood, it's getting used an awful lot. What's the appeal for cities and towns?
Well, right. I mean, TIF has actually been around for a long time, more than 50 years now. It started, at least started to be widely used first in California. I think the appeal of it is that it seems to many people like free money. You don't have to raise taxes, and yet you get to promise to spend money on some particular kind of development. And so in the political sphere, I think that's the appeal of it. For people like me that are interested in good public policy, it's a little different appeal. I think the potential virtue of TIF is that it allows you really to align the incentives of the city, the public partner, and the private partner. And the way it can do that is the private partner wants the city to commit and wants the local government to commit to say that they're going to develop the area, or they're going to do the kinds of things that are necessary to make it a good place to do business or a good place to live. And the public partner wants the private developer to agree that they're really going to be committed to this project, that they're going to put money in, that they're not going to walk away from it midway. And what TIF does is it creates a mechanism that can have that happen, because the private developer doesn't get any money unless the land values increase and generate more property tax revenue. And the city doesn't commit any money to the developer unless the developer does what it wants. But the city has said that they can't really back away from the deal once they've created the TIF, or it's difficult to back away from the deal. So it's kind of like an iron handshake that brings the two sides together.
Yeah, it sort of locks things in. And for economic development, particularly in rebounding cities and other places, it's really determines the future of these cities. Now, some might be a little reminded of property tax breaks for business location, another very common practice, most recently seen in the bidding for Amazon's HQ2. And I think it reflects a certain skepticism or suspicion that TIF ends up being a very good deal for private developers, and that there's sometimes almost a sense of desperation by the cities trying to rev up this economic development who offer it. Have you encountered that, or what do you think about that kind of skepticism?
Sure. I've seen that criticism of TIF, and the answer is it really depends. TIF is a tool, and it can be used appropriately or misused, and it's one of a number of potential tools that can be used to subsidize economic development. The question about do you ever want to subsidize economic development? The answer is, I think, probably yes. There are probably situations where it's appropriate. Do you always want to subsidize economic development? The answer is certainly no. And so the real question is whether TIF gets overused. And I think we certainly have seen places where it has been overused. And I think that largely has to do, again, with going back to the perception of that it seems like free money. It's a less painful way of subsidizing economic development than straight out providing cash to the developer.
Right, yes. Now, this might be as good a time as any to get into an important distinction. We don't have to spend a lot of time on this, but the difference between TIF and land value capture. Now, that might sound a little like the public finance equivalent of angels on a pin, but the basic difference, it seems to me, is that a TIF sequesters the property tax that a development would pay over time, whereas in value capture, that's all about measuring the increased value of a development, essentially that has been the result of government action like a rezoning or a public investment like a subway line or a park. In TIF, there's little or none of that additional value in the calculation. Is that right?
Yeah, I think it really is. So value capture is typically a way of the public sector saying, look, when you're a developer, part of the reason you're able to have appreciation of your land is because of the things we do as a public sector. We put in a new road or a subway system, or we clean up an area in terms of crime or remediate environmental hazards. And since the developer is benefiting from that public investment, it's somewhat reasonable for the public to say, okay, we want a chunk of the increased value. They take that in the form of value capture. TIF is really quite different. It's saying, okay, we will give the developer some of the increase in value, some of the tax that they would normally pay from an increase in value. We'll give them back some of the revenue that they would have paid. So in a sense, it's almost the opposite of value capture, where instead of taking from the developer, we're giving the developer above and beyond the value that's created.
Well, we don't want to be all doom and gloom here, but we do want to face up to some of the real concerns about TIF and talk about that. Another part of the backlash against TIF, if we can say that there is one, is that parents and teachers worry that it siphons off badly needed property tax revenue for schools. I know this is something that you have seen in your travels, and how big of an issue has that been around the country?
Well, it's been a huge issue in some places, particularly in a place like the city of Chicago, where you have a very, very large chunk, maybe as much as a third of the property value in a TIF. There's the increment, the growth in land values, or the revenue from the growth in land values, is going into this fund and being used exclusively for economic development and not for children's education. And that's been concerning to a lot of people. It's particularly concerning when the city controls the TIF and the school district has to pay the bills to educate the children. So it can be a real problem. There are various mechanisms, and we discuss some of these in the report, that can be used to kind of mitigate that problem and to kind of protect the school districts from those issues. But it's a major point, and I should mention it's not only school districts. There's also any overlying government. It could be a park district, a library district, or a county. Any of those kind of overlying governments potentially could lose some of their revenue because of a TIF.
We're talking with David Merriman, author of Improving Tax Increment Financing for Economic Development, a report of the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. It's available on our website, lincolninst.edu. Another concern is gentrification. When government gets into the business of choosing what projects to support, they might end up picking some that just need a little boost, but ultimately end up producing things like a Starbucks or a parking garage. Are TIFs supposed to be used to clean up so-called blight? And have you seen cases where they've been used in neighborhoods that are sort of already turning the corner, so that there are cases where TIF actually ends up accelerating gentrification?
Yeah, the answer is that I definitely have seen that charge made, and I think we do have some evidence that TIF is sometimes used in that way. And here's a problem with the design of TIF that, again, I think needs some work. The overlying government, the city that creates the TIF, is only able to get revenue out of the TIF if you get market value growth, if the property value grows. So if you're a mayor or something and you TIF an area, you want to be confident that you're going to get the money so that you have more ribbon cutting so that you can pay the bonds. And one way to do that is to look at areas that are already starting to grow. So, typically this is areas sort of near the downtown that are doing pretty well but haven't yet developed. And that's really very different, as you mentioned, from the original purpose of TIF. Most TIF legislation in most states puts, at least as one of the primary purposes of TIF, getting rid of blight. And it turns out that's a lot harder because generally you need not just, at least in a really blighted area, a really impoverished area, you need not just a little boost, but you need a big boost. And very often TIF alone won't do it.
Right. Yeah. And different neighborhoods in different stages of transition. You also write about transparency. You mentioned Chicago, where it turns out effectively a large part of the city budget of city revenues and ended up being kind of like locked up in TIF deals. And there was a sense that not very many people had a clear understanding of what the money was going for, that the TIF districts amounted to a bunch of slush funds sort of doled out at the discretion of the mayor. How has that situation improved in Chicago, and what are other cities doing to make sure the process is visible?
Right. So Chicago is really a case study because it's used TIF so extensively. And when TIF started, which is back in the late 70s or early 80s, there wasn't really a lot of information available on it, and the then mayor was able to sort of control what TIF was used for and spend the money pretty much without anybody looking over their shoulder. The city council didn't do a great job of monitoring the mayor and wasn't really an effective restraint. And gradually there became more and more controversy about this. And a lot of people worked very hard to collect the data, to do Freedom of Information Acts, to get information. And the city really has reacted over time more and more, and there's now a huge amount of information on the web in Chicago, a huge amount of information about what the plans are for each of we have more than 140 TIF districts, what the plans are for the districts, where the money is supposed to go, who's getting the money, what the maps of the districts look like, etc. But still, there's always more that we would like to know, and often we don't know exactly how the money is spent. Other cities, Chicago is maybe more than any other city that I've seen has provided this information on the web. Many other cities provide very little information, and states often do little monitoring of the TIF. So in almost all states, the state has to have legislation that allows the TIF, but then the cities actually pick for each TIF that's created, the cities okay it. And in some states, it was unbelievable to me as I was doing my research. In some states, the people at the state level don't even know how many TIF districts there are. They don't know where they are. They don't know what the money is being spent on. And there's no requirement that the city really make that information available to the citizens. So that's been a huge issue, and something it seems to me, frankly, rather easy for state legislators to put a little effort into to make that information more clear.
Right. Yeah. So, okay, it sounds like transparency is really important, and an area where states and cities need to do some more work. What else is being done to improve TIFs? Someone in public finance told me that a standalone TIF, she called it a naked TIF, is increasingly rare. That, in other words, that TIF is being bundled with other measures, stabilization funds, credit enhancement. How has that been working lately, sort of TIF evolving?
Well, as I said, almost all states have TIFs, and very often, TIF legislation gets tinkered with almost on a yearly basis. And some of the movements around the country are certainly to make TIF more transparent, to confine the use of TIF to, as we talked about before, to blighted areas, or in some cases environmentally damaged areas, so to narrow the use of TIF. California, where TIF had been really, really widely used a few years back, totally revamped their TIF program. First they got rid of it, and then they let it in. But there's much more emphasis on affordable housing, and there's much tighter controls on how the money is being used. So I'd say the big legislative moves that at least the reformers have talked about is trying to narrow the situations in which TIF can be used and also to provide more information about how it's used.
And used for some different, perhaps more targeted outcomes. I was recently up in Portland, Maine, which is a small market city these days. It's been deploying different kinds of sort of tailored TIFs, one for 100% affordable housing, for example. They're also talking about trying to use TIF for climate resilience. In Minneapolis, which is really the scene of some extraordinary innovation and policy to address equity, they're researching the possibility of offering a TIF to complement affordability requirements in new residential development, so that 10% of a given project would have to be affordable under inclusionary housing, and then another 10% would be funded by TIF. It seems like there's just a lot of experimentation out there. Are you picking up on that as well?
Yeah, I have definitely seen that too. The people are trying to figure out how to use TIF. I should mention, I guess, one other kind of innovation that we had in Chicago. As I said, we had many TIFs in Chicago under an old model, but just recently we got a new law which allowed for what we call a transportation TIF. And the transportation TIF is just for areas really near our subway system, our L system we call it here. It's 1/4 mile on each side. And it avoids some of the other problems, like it doesn't take money from schools. And it's really used pretty much exclusively to shore up the public transportation system and actually provides a match for a big chunk of federal funds that we got. And so it's a targeted use, but it's a use that's kind of innovative and takes into account many of the criticisms that people have put on the older TIF program.
We're talking with David Merriman, author of the Lincoln Institute report, Improving Tax Increment Financing for Economic Development. What else do you see on the horizon for economic development? We're really talking about the ability of cities all over to be more livable, sustainable, equitable, and attract different kinds of businesses. There's one initiative that we've been watching from the current administration, opportunity zones, where money that otherwise would be taxed for capital gains can be directed to worthy projects and cities. Do you suppose that opportunity zones might start to eclipse TIFs at all?
Well, it's hard to say. That's a federal program, and the TIFs are generally state and local programs. So I don't think they're going to be used nearly as widely as TIF. And the opportunity zone is, of course, an idea that's been around for a while. There were empowerment zones before. Many states have things they call enterprise zones. They're all some variant of basically in an area where you have a poor population, a blighted area as well, trying to give tax breaks to encourage economic development in those areas. Unfortunately, the economic literature looking at these things finds they generally haven't performed really well. They seem to be greatly influenced by political overtones, and in many cases do not add a lot to economic development. So, I think there could be a place for these, but I think fundamentally what best helps economic development is to have a well-functioning property tax system, a well-functioning system of public services, and to really have a viable plan about how your economy is going to go forward, and not so much to focus on, competing, drawing businesses from one place to another, but rather to make your area, just generally solid and a good, fundamentally strong. So, that's what I hope going forward. There'll be more talk about those kinds of policies.
Well, it sounds like TIF is going to be a big part of the future of cities for the foreseeable future. Finally, I understand you're leaving soon to talk TIF in Turkey. In our final moments here, can you tell us a little bit about that trip and the use of TIF and other instruments like that abroad? Is TIF taking off internationally?
Well, TIF has been used in some places in Europe. It's used in Canada. My understanding is they haven't used it in Turkey, but there's some people in Turkey. They have a lot of cities that are earthquake prone, and cities were built not to have adequate risk with respect to earthquake, and they're trying to think about how to renovate those areas, and TIF is one option they're considering. So I'm going over there really to tell them about the U.S. experience and to make them understand that it's a policy option. It's got some potential, but I think you also want to be very careful about how you introduce it. So if they are going to use TIF, I want them to, design their legislation in a way that it will be used for its intended purposes and not be abused.
Well, David Merriman, professor at the University of Illinois at Chicago, thank you so much for being part of the first Land Matters podcast.
Thank you. It's been fun.
Well, that'll do it for this episode. We're going to be looking at all kinds of other elements of successful cities, preparing for climate change, managing water resources, dealing with slums worldwide, the Yes in My Backyard movement, and much more. We're finding answers in land. So join us next time for Land Matters, the podcast of the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. I'm Anthony Flint. Thanks for listening.